Well, good evening, class. My name is Dr. Richard Erickson, and I'll be your instructor for Business 374 Economics. I trust by now you've had a chance to look at the syllabus and have an idea what this course is all about and kind of the scope of the requirements that will be involved in this class. But there will be papers as well as discussion board material that's going to be necessary, and you'll be doing some online presentations, which are going to be something we'll talk about a little bit later. At any rate, just a little bit about myself. I've been teaching at Judson since 2005. Prior to that, I was a professor at Northern Illinois University in DeKalb. Before that, I taught at Wheaton College for 5 years. And prior to that, I had about 30-some years as an entrepreneur. So I've done a lot of different kinds of things, but I really have a special place in my heart for students like yourself that are going back to school, finishing a degree, working a full-time job, taking care of family concerns, and also trying to be a student. And it's a challenging sort of a thing. It requires a tremendous amount of discipline, and I just trust that you'll have a profitable time this semester. If you have questions or concerns or things you'd like me to address, please get in touch with me. Email is one way to get a hold of me, and the other way is to give me a phone call. I have a cell phone number of 815-566-6140, and I welcome any of your phone calls at any time if you have questions or problems or things you need me to help you address. Again, having looked at your syllabus, you see that tonight we're going to cover 2 chapters, and I will be just kind of hitting some of the highlights that I want to make sure you understand and you deal with, and then kind of give an idea of what we're looking for the following week, which will include your first paper. Chapter 1 starts out with a discussion about what economics is all about. The title is Limits, Alternatives, and Choices. And it kind of highlights or puts into context the economic problem, and that is we all have wants and needs, and we also are faced with limited resources. So the problem is, how do individuals or institutions and society make choices under conditions of scarcity? With scarce resources, not enough resources to address all of our needs and wants, how do we make choices? And okay, so the instructor has remembered now to turn off his phone, and hopefully we won't be interrupted again at this point. As we were saying, society, individuals, all of us in market economies need to make choices faced with scarce resources and a plethora of needs and wants. And so economics basically is the social sciences concerned with how we make these choices. And like my friend Jay Kessler used to say, all models are three-legged dogs, and economics is just full of models. And in order to understand a complex system, we often try to make simplifying assumptions about it so that we can get our hands around it. We can make the problem more tractable. And economics is no different, and we have certain assumptions or perspectives that arise in economics, and they include things like the fact that individuals and institutions make rational choices by comparing marginal benefits and costs of their actions. Well, this is only to say that that we look at things and we ask ourselves what kind of benefit or satisfaction will we get by acquiring this, the results of this decision. And by that, utility is the word that we typically use in economics. Utility is the satisfaction or the what we derive from a particular choice. And we compare those benefits with the costs. And if the benefits are perceived to be greater than the costs associated with them, we'll generally make that choice. But as we are also aware, every choice that we make includes not only the cost, the direct cost of that choice, but something else called opportunity costs. And opportunity costs are the values of a good, service, or time foregone in order to obtain something else. So we need to concern ourselves not only with the cost of the direct cost of a particular decision, but also the cost of giving up something. I think our textbook gave an example of Bill Gates or Oprah Winfrey or some baseball player, I guess Alex Rodriguez, and they had been told, no doubt, as younger people, that going to college was important, getting a good degree. But also, they were faced with huge opportunity costs. To go to school to earn a few more bucks would have slowed them down when they were able to go out in the marketplace and be quite successful. So opportunity costs are non-trivial and need to be taken into account. Well, some of the other assumptions that are built into the economic thinking is not only the rational self-interest notion and utility maximization, but also marginal analysis. So the rational self-interest we ran into when we saw the work by Adam Smith that talks about the benign self-interest, the enlightened self-interest of individuals ends up making society better off as a whole. It seems somewhat counterintuitive at first, but everybody being selfish and looking out for themselves, but in fact their behavior sends messages to suppliers of goods and services and allows for the most important or the most desired by society of these things to be provided. Economics is built on the scientific method. It utilizes the inquiry that has been widely used across many disciplines, where we make an observation, we form a hypothesis, which is our best guess of the explanation, and then we test our hypothesis to see if the data supports the notion. And if a theory is well tested and widely accepted and perhaps duplicated by other investigators, they end up referring to it as a law or a principle, which in turn is utilized to make predictions concerning the effects of certain actions. Principles are generalizations, and underlying these generalizations is the notion of that Latin phrase, ceteris paribus. Ceteris paribus means that all things else being equal, this is what the impact of some independent variable might be. You know, if we were to be growing corn and trying to do an experiment to find out how to best increase our yield, suppose that we added additional irrigation or additional water to our fields. At the same time, we included more fertilizer per acre. And if we had a higher yield as a result of that at the end of the season, we'd have a bit of a problem, wouldn't we? Because we wouldn't know whether or not it was the fertilizer or the water or some combination of the two that caused our increase in yield. So generally, when we do experiments, we try to hold everything else equal, the ceteris paribus notion, and we only vary one variable at a time. Just change the water or just change the amount of fertilizer, and then observe the results of that kind of a change. And the other thing we also do with our research and our investigation of some economic principles is to express them graphically. And so you'll see in your textbook and throughout this course a number of graphs. Always be a little bit skeptical, a little bit careful when you observe a graph, because some people use graphs to tell a story that may not be the full picture of the actual reality. What happens is that they might exaggerate either the x-axis or the y-axis to emphasize or to tell a story that is maybe somewhat different than reality. A couple of terms we need to be reminded of. Textbook mentions microeconomics and macroeconomics. Basic difference here is that microeconomics is concerned with individual decision-making units, the choices under uncertainty and in the face of scarcity that individuals might make. macroeconomics is that part of economics concerned with the economy as a whole, or major components of the economy. And what they do basically is aggregate all the information or all the data that is produced by the individual economic units and treat them as if they were one single unit. So perhaps all consumers, or total employment numbers, or total income for a country or society. And the macroeconomic events are driven by large-scale kinds of things, as opposed to the individual decisions a person might make between choosing which bread to buy at the grocery store. So again, the economic problem that we're faced with is individuals and societies have to make choices because the wants exceed their means, and they're limited by their income, their time, and their resources. One of the tools that economists use to show the various trade-offs, and isn't all of life a series of trade-offs, is the notion of a budget line. And the budget line is a line that shows the various combinations of two different products that a consumer can buy with specific money income and given the product prices. So you'll see in your textbook the combination of, I think the two examples were pizzas in one case and robots in the other. At any rate, one of them represented consumption now and the other represented investment in some capital goods, so that you might have greater consumption down the road. At any rate, all of the points along the curve on the actual budget line are various combinations of products that a consumer can buy, and anything in the interior between the origin and the curve itself is also an attainable combination of items and products that the consumer can buy. Things above the line, however, are unattainable. Those points on the line are actually maximizing utility. They're giving you the greatest amount of satisfaction for a given income constraint, given resource constraint. It's interesting to note, though, that where people would choose to consume is dependent on their own particular utility function. Individuals would choose different points based on what was more important to them. You can understand that different people value things differently. One person might value security in choosing a job. Somebody else might value freedom more than security. So depending upon what your taste individual choices might be, you'll put yourself at different points on that budget line, even though you might have the same income or resources available as another person. The actual position of the budget line can be changed with changes in income, or in the case of a country or a nation, changes in resources or changes in technology. So society is making similar kind of trade-off choices between different things. Now, you can make different choices along the same curve because of differences in utility. And it's also interesting to note that even the same good, given higher quantities, may not have the same utility. If you're crossing a desert, that first liter of water might have very high utility, but liter number 412 may not mean as much to you. You may not be willing to give up as much to obtain that last liter as you would the previous one. And again, when we look at societies, the resource categories that societies have to work with, or the factors of production, or the inputs, are generally captured in the following general areas. First of all, land, or what might be called the gifts of nature, which includes all natural resources. The second resource category is that of labor, both the physical and the mental activities used in the income production process. Thirdly, capital, the human-made resources like buildings, machinery, and equipment that are used to produce goods and services. Investment is nothing more than the purchase of capital resources. And then finally, entrepreneurial ability, the human talent that combines other resources to produce a product or make a strategic decision to bear the risk, i.e. it's just the spark plug or the catalyst that makes businesses go. Well, the production possibilities model has a certain other assumptions in it, and that is the notion of full employment. Because if we're less than full employment, then we're going to be in the interior or the less efficient region of the possibilities curve. It assumes fixed resources and fixed technologies. And in an example of the book of the capital goods and the consumer goods, if you chose closer to the y-axis where the capital goods are, that's suggesting that you're interested in consuming less today so that you can buy plant and equipment, make machinery that will enable you to consume at a higher level, maybe shift that technology curve, having technology shift that would push that curve outward. So, and those who would choose more consumer goods now want to eat their seed corn. They want to eat it all now and not save something back for possible consumption at a later point. So those are just cases where you see that different utility function or different way people value the benefits puts them at different places along that line. Also, you might notice that because of the law of increasing opportunity cost, that is to say, as the production of a good increases, the opportunity cost of producing additional units increase. That's because the economic resources are not completely adaptable to all alternative uses. So that if you're a producer of wheat, once you've used all the good land to grow wheat on, then you might have to turn to plots of ground that are not as fertile. Maybe they're rockier, maybe they're not as suited for growing wheat, and you end up with higher costs of producing additional units of wheat. So the law of increasing opportunity cost shows that you can have a production possibility curve that's concave to the origin. So the optimal allocation will occur at some point on the production possibility curve, or on the production frontier there, where the marginal cost is exactly equal to the marginal benefit. That implies as long as the marginal benefit of an additional unit of a good is still greater than the marginal cost, one should keep on expanding that economic activity. But when the marginal cost exceeds the marginal benefit, then you're going to see a cessation of attempts to acquire additional units of that particular good. Again, we mentioned that unemployment implies that a point on the interior is an obtainable region is possible, but it's not on the curve. And the only way we can push that curve out is to acquire additional resources or to change the technology. The size of the possibility curve shifts is a function of both present and future choices. All economic growth is a result of either an increase in resources, an improvement of resource quality, or some technological advance. Okay, in Chapter 2, we take a look at the market system and the circular flow. Economic systems are a particular set of institutional arrangements and coordinating mechanisms that produce goods and services. And systems will differ based on who owns the factors of production and what methods are used to motivate, coordinate, and direct economic activity. And of course, the textbook outlined two extremes of economic systems. One, the command system, which was represented by socialism or communism or some sort of collectivism system, versus the market system or the capitalistic system. Under command systems, the government is going to own most property resources. Under the market system, that's going to be contrasted with private ownership of resources. Under the command system, there's going to be central planning of production of goods and their quantities. So what's going to happen is a group of people are going to get together in a room and decide how many shoes we're going to produce for our country in this next fiscal year or next time period, whatever it is.
and what style we're going to make. And it requires a whole lot of hubris, to my way of thinking, or a whole lot of chutzpah to say that we are wise enough to make decisions for all the people in our country that's going to best suit their needs and the country's needs as well. Contrasted to that are the notion of free markets and of prices determining and directing economic activity. That is to say, people vote with their dollars to make their choices, and the goods that are able to command prices sufficient to cover the cost of producing them as well as making a profit for the producers are going to be preferred, and those whose can't produce total revenues greater than total costs, those businesses are going to contract and eventually disappear. So, in a command economy, you have a central plan based on government objectives, centralized decision making, whereas in the market system, rational self-interest, individually dispersed decision making are the hallmarks, and the one has produced equal misery and lower levels of lifestyle, and the other has produced greater good for more people. Rational, self-interested, market capitalistic systems have done more for the poor, have lifted more people out of poverty than any other system that has ever been designed. I'm curious to know how some people in our society today are suddenly enamored with the idea of socialism when it's failed at every attempt to implement it in a nation. But yet some people are listening to politicians today who contend that that's the way to make everybody equal. Unfortunately, what they don't understand is it'll make everybody equally miserable at a lower level of lifestyle than is possible by the capitalist system. Well, private property, which is the right of persons and firms to obtain and control, to employ, dispose of, and bequeath land, capital, and other property, includes the right to negotiate binding legal contracts and mutually agreeable economic transactions. Property rights also include intellectual property. So these are hallmarks of the free market economies. It also includes freedom of enterprise and choice. It allows us to be self-interested or to operate maximizing our own utility functions. There's a linear programming method called the simplex algorithm, which has the capacity to maximize some objective function and subject to many constraints. So some of these big problems might have 500 things they're trying to maximize subject to a couple thousand constraints. And but that's a mathematical way at arriving at an understanding of the best combination of goods and services to produce. Well, competition, the presence of independent buyers and sellers and additional players in the marketplace vying with each other, and the freedom of buyers and sellers to leave the marketplace or enter the market based on self-interest implies a diffusion of economic power and the ability of an economy to adapt to changes. It's the basic regulatory and disciplining principle that underlies market capitalistic systems. Market institution or mechanism that brings buyers and sellers together. And that's what a market is. It's a mechanism that brings buyers and sellers together. And prices and information about those prices are what determine what quantities of which products will be produced. Things like technological and capital goods are the drivers of production efficiency. The notion of specialization enters in here. You might recall Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. He used an illustration of the pin makers, and back in the day, in the 1700s when Smith wrote, there was an artisan trade called a pin maker who made pins and nail-like devices, and they did each one of the 18 different steps that were required to make a pin, and in a good day they might produce 20 or 30 pins. But by breaking down those 18 steps and assigning an individual to just accomplish the one task, just to do the one step, and then pass it on to the next person to perform another another task, the combination might have brought the production up to 3,500 pins per person per day. Vast increase in output just by utilizing the division of labor, making uses of differences in ability, fostering the learning by doing. That's why when I used to be involved in developing information systems for companies, you always wanted to bring end users into the process early on, because number one, if they didn't feel like they had any skin in the game or any ownership of the process, they might end up sabotaging your efforts. But number two, they knew the actual ground level tricks and things that needed to be taken into account. And they also would then have skin in the game and feel a responsibility that their success was somehow tied to the success of the overall project. So utilizing the individual's particular abilities, the differential skills they had, allowing them to do the same kind of thing over and over to develop new and better techniques, faster, more efficient ways of doing things, increase the output, and the society ended up with greater output for lower resource costs, and it was an important contributor to higher levels of benefit. Well, one of the things that made exchange of goods and services much easier was the invention of and use of money. Now, there is another system that could be utilized to exchange goods, and that's the notion of the barter system. If I've got potatoes and you make shoes, and you happen to want some potatoes and I want some shoes, we probably could work a deal whereby I could give you a number of potatoes to entice you to give me a new pair of shoes. However, this is something that requires what's called a double coincidence of wants. We need to want the same thing the other guy can produce at the same time, and that's not always easy to do. But with money, this fungible, this a medium of exchange, I can get shoes by giving him money, and he in turn can go buy what he wants from whoever is willing to sell whatever they have for the money. It's interesting to know that Genghis Khan is one of the originators of paper money. When Marco Polo was traveling, he found this curious thing that Khan had created, which was a special paper produced by the mulberry tree bark, and a special ink on there with the seal of the Khan on there, and they used this thing like money. And what's one of the first things that you're concerned about with in money, paper money? One of the concerns is the idea of counterfeiting, right? Well, what Khan did is he said, if you see my seal in this red ink on this mulberry baked paper, you will accept it and you will utilize it the way it was intended to be done. And if you don't, or you try to counterfeit it, the penalty is instant death. Well, that's a pretty good enforcer. But at any rate, money made it a whole lot easier to transact and to facilitate markets without the friction that would be associated with the barter system. Another characteristic is active but limited government. If you look at, there are certain needs for government intervention, but the more the government gets involved in the system, the less efficient the system becomes, and the more friction is created, and the more challenges there are to attempting to have an efficient economy. Well, 4 questions whose answer is shaped by the markets, in fact, were the 4 questions that you had to face in the discussion board. And that is, what goods and services will be produced? And the answer to that is some form of the notion that goods and services will be produced such that If the total revenue exceeds the total cost, i.e. the marketplace is interested in having it, that particular good or service, it will be produced. And as far as how the goods and services will be produced, it'll be produced the most efficient way based on allocating scarce resources. And it'll be produced in accordance with the dollar votes that consumers make. Who gets them? The people who are willing to give up, who value the good greater than the cost or the money they have to give up to acquire it. And how will the system promote progress? Well, technology and appealing to consumers or to the buyers to convince them that the benefits of the product that they have exceed the money that they're charging them for it. Continuing on, just to put it in more graphical terms, what will be produced as long as the total revenue is increased, total costs, industries are going to expand. Total revenue is less than total cost, industries will contract. Consumers are sovereign, and they accomplish their sovereignty by dollar votes. Goods and services will be produced in such a way that will minimize the cost per unit of output, and competition will eliminate high-cost producers. Back in the 60s, the Boston Consulting Group put out a well-known study called the PIM study, and basically what the PIM study concluded was that the first company or the first producers who come to market with a new product that the marketplace likes will enjoy nice fat margins. They'll be able to get the biggest gap between what they sell something for and what it costs them to produce it. And if person A starts producing widgets and making a lot of money, then person B is going to come along and try to get in that same business, maybe cut the price a little bit. And what will ultimately happen is that they'll drive the long-run cost or price of the product down to its long-run cost, i.e. they'll earn enough money to pay for producing the thing and getting a return that's equal to the required rate of return for products for transactions of equal risk. So goods and services will be produced in ways that minimize costs. Competition will eliminate high-cost producers, and the people that get the output are those who are willing and able to pay the existing market price. Now, and then technology and accumulation of capital will enable systems to promote progress. Then you might take a look in your textbook at the circular flow model. It's kind of a clockwise flow of money and a counterclockwise flow of resources and goods and services, so that you can see that money from the resource market goes to households in the form of income as the households lend land, labor, and capital. And the households in turn will sell resources and buy products. So they'll consume goods and buy products. The product market will provide them. They'll get goods and services from businesses that produce them and return the revenue to the businesses, which in turn will go after resources, buy resources, and sell products. And you can just see that circular flow. And the last thing that Chapter 2 talks about is the business entity structures. There are three major types of entities that are used to form companies or businesses. And the most common one is the sole proprietorship. Sole proprietorships are basically Rich Erickson decides one day to sell widgets, and he opens up his door and puts out a sign and says, "Come buy your widgets from me." Doesn't require anything particularly complex or legal to do, and because it's easy to do, most new companies or new businesses start out that way. In fact, I think the textbook says something like 72% of all new businesses are formed as sole proprietorships. But interesting to note, there's only sole proprietorships only account for a small percentage of the revenues of all businesses. Their sales revenues represent something like 4% of the total pie. So the problems with sole proprietorships in contrast to the good parts, which are ease of formation and total control by the proprietor over the company, the downside is that you have unlimited liability. Another downside is that if you die, the business oftentimes dies as well without some way of having succession of new operators. And so one of the other problems is acquiring capital. Because sole proprietorships have limited lives, banks are less likely to do long-term lending, as well as they're less likely to invest money in something that whose fate hinges on the survivorship of a single proprietor. Another thing that comes along as a business form is the partnership. You still see partnerships oftentimes in law and accounting and some of these consulting businesses, but and they represent something like 10% of the entities in the business world in the United States, but yet they only account for about 15% of the revenues. The good part, or the upside of partnerships, is that you acquire some additional expertise and a different set of inputs. You also can raise money a little bit better because you've got two pots to draw on. But there's also downside. Again, not only are you liable for all of your losses and any losses of the business, you're liable for the actions of your partner. One of the things I would caution new entrepreneurs is, if you like people, don't go into partnership with them. If they're part of your family, don't make Christmas impossible. Stay away from partnerships with them, and you'll both be a whole lot happier. If they ask you to join your business as a partner, tell them I love you too much to go into business with you. At any rate, that leaves the corporation, which represents maybe 18% of the business entities out there in the United States, but they account for 81% of the revenue. And there's lots of reasons for that. First of all, it's a legal entity which has a separate existence from the people who own the corporation, and they own it in the form of shares of stock. But the risk of the owners of the corporation is limited to the money they put into the corporation. Whereas in a sole proprietorship, if I have a responsible for some tragic outcome, I can be sued for everything I own, my firstborn, and everything I've got. Whereas in a corporation, because of limited liability, you can only lose the money you put into the corporation. And banks are more likely to lend successful corporations because they know they're going to exist into perpetuity. And it's easier to attract new investment because you can sell fractional shares of the company in the marketplace. So corporations have lots of upside. There are also downsides, though. The only two ways you can get money out of a corporation are either through dividends or through capital gains, when you own their stocks and sell them for more than you paid for them. The problem with corporate dividends are the corporation pays a tax on profits and can only issue dividends out of the profits or the retained earnings of a firm. And then when the individual that owns the stock and gets the dividend receives a dividend, they're taxed again on that dividend income. So you have this double taxation problem. Now, there are forms of corporations like S-corps and LLCs that operate more on a pass-through sort of basis, where the money passes through right straight to the individual owner's 1040s, and therefore you don't face a double taxation problem. But then there's limits on the kinds of things that the S-corps and the LLCs can deduct as well. So each one has its advantages and disadvantages. Well, I think those are some of the main topics that you're going to run into in the first two chapters. Be sure you read them. If you want to work some problems in the back of the book, there's answers in the back in the appendix. If you have questions or concerns about any of the material, I welcome emails, and ultimately, if you don't hear back from me quick enough, you can give me a buzz as well. For next week, you're going to have a paper on elasticities, and be sure you contact or check your syllabus as to how you're going to be formatting and the length of the paper. I think it's 4 to 5 pages. The topic that you're going to cover, you're going to take a product or something and show what the elasticities are. Elasticities just talk about how prices affect quantities sold, and how sensitive something is to a change in price. For instance, if a $10,000 heart surgery were suddenly to go to $11,000, you might not think twice about spending the extra $1,000 to get your heart surgery done, because that heart surgeries are relatively inelastic. On the other hand, if the cost of a can of Pepsi suddenly went up to $1,000 more, you'd probably buy a whole lot less Pepsi. You might turn to what are called substitutes, like Coca-Cola or some other substitute for it, some other soft drink or something, or you just might not drink any soda at all if the prices were that much higher. So that the quantity demanded in a society would likely drop significantly because of a relatively elastic good. So, at any rate, be sure to post in a timely fashion next week. Your first post needs to be up 48 hours prior to posting, prior to the class meeting, which is 6 o'clock on Tuesdays. And your 2 responses are also due by 6 o'clock on Tuesdays as well. So have a good week, and if you have questions, email me, call me, and good luck. Thank you.